For the longest time, whenever I heard people say sugar addiction or carb addiction or food addiction, I thought it sounded ridiculous. Like, how could you have an addiction to sugar or carbs? Addiction was for things like drugs or alcohol or gambling. Well, sugar addiction is real. Carb addiction is real. Food addiction has literally been shown by MRI scans of the brain. And there's a good chance that if you're here watching this episode, that you may have elements of food addiction to overcome, because most of the foods that we encounter are intentionally designed to be addictive. And our physiology works in a way where we are going to have a heightened dopamine response from these foods and crave them again and again. Now, this is a carnivore channel, and you might be wondering how this is relevant. But understanding addictive foods is crucial for changing your eating successfully long term, because most people struggle with cravings for non-carnivore foods while they attempt this diet. So if you are going to do carnivore for the long haul, you have to understand that food addiction is real and why you feel compelled to eat modern hyperpalatable foods, the foods that are excessively pleasing to our taste buds and the reward system in our brain. If you haven't heard of the term hyperpalatable food before, these are foods that are carefully crafted and designed combinations of carbs, sugar, fat, and salt, and are extremely stimulating. Think brownies, potato chips, fast food, pretty much anything that you have a hard time controlling yourself around. Most of the foods we are surrounded by today are hyperpalatable foods and have been made that way by food scientists. They have really powerful effects on our brains and are often used to manage stress and change our emotional states. Part of what has eliminated my feelings of deprivation on carnivore has been really understanding the addictiveness of modern foods and knowing and appreciating that carnivore opts me out of the struggle against the modern foods that are addictive by design. I want you to think of a food that you tend to have less control over, a food that you may overeat or always want more of. Maybe it's some form of sugar like cookies or cake or ice cream. For me, it's definitely all of those. Sugar was my ultimate nemesis. Or maybe it's something else like potato chips or nachos, something snacky. Just think of something you wish you had more control around or that you wish you could stop eating so much, and share it in the comments below. Now I'm going to read how substance use disorder is defined in the 5th edition of the American Psychiatric Association's official handbook. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5. The substance is often taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than was intended. There is a persistent desire or unsuccessful effort to cut down or control use of the substance. A great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain the substance, use the substance, or recover from its effects. Craving or a strong desire or urge to use the substance occurs. And the last one I'll share, use of the substance is continued despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem that is likely to have been caused or exacerbated by the substance. These are only 5 of the 10 statements that they share, and I will link to it in the show notes if you want to take a look. But for me, sugar fits all of those statements I just read, big time. Take the first one, eating more than intended. I can't tell you how many times I'd cut a cupcake in half and say I was only going to eat half of it, and then I'd cut the remaining half into quarters and then cut again until I ate the whole thing. Literally, my in-laws would make fun of me for doing this. I've always eaten far more than intended with a lot of things, but especially sugar. I had sugar cravings all the time, and controlling it felt really hard, even though sugar literally made me sick every time I ate it. It took me 3 years to get to a place where I have broken my addictive relationship with sugar, and I think most people would say that sugar is really addictive. This has been a pretty common sentiment for a while because it's true for a lot of people. One of my favorite articles is this one. I think the title is so amazing. It says, Healthline survey reveals Americans know sugar is bad, but cannot stop eating it. And then further down, it talks about their results surveying 3,000 people about sugar. And they say, the Healthline Sugar Survey finds that while Americans are aware of the negative effects of sugar, they aren't doing much about it because they don't actually know how. How spot on is that? We are addicted to sugar. And there are scientists who assert that sugar is more addictive than cocaine. There's a study called Intense Sweetness Can Surpass Cocaine Reward, where they had rats that were addicted to cocaine. And after the rats were given sugar, 94% of the rats preferred the sugar over the cocaine. But what's even crazier is that this preference was not surmountable by increasing the cocaine. There are many more studies by a group of Princeton psychologists who studied signs of sugar addiction in rats for years, and they showed that sugar is an addictive substance that causes changes in the brain and behavior in a similar way to drugs like cocaine, morphine, and nicotine. Facing food addiction was one of my biggest hurdles with doing carnivore because you're eliminating all of the hyperpalatable high dopamine foods. I think even with something like paleo or keto, you see a lot of people making keto treats with sugar alcohols and nut flours. And I'm not judging, I did that too. But you can't really do that on carnivore. And no one fixes an emotional problem or bad day with a chicken breast. You go to ice cream or cookies or potato chips. I remember I once came to a point where I was actually frightened by my addiction. Once I started giving up sugar with willpower, my body got used to eating much less of it. So much so that if I did have sugar, my body would be in distress. My blood pressure went up, my heart would be pounding, I would get diarrhea, I'd be up all night tossing and turning and sweating, and so much more misery. But I had such a strong addiction to using sugar to deal with stress that I would completely disregard those consequences and eat it anyway. I would pick 10 minutes of pleasure while eating it as being more important than the hours afterward that I was sick to my stomach. The cue and relationship was so strong. Early on, when I was just beginning to dabble with carnivore, I wrote the following in a carnivore support group. I said, my biggest obstacle to being consistent with carnivore is the boredom. I've always used food as the antidote to boredom in my life, using it as entertainment. Whether my day sucks or I'm looking for an excuse to go out to a restaurant, dopamine fireworks, sugary, starchy foods for much of my life have been at the center of my day. I once heard someone say that if the most interesting part of your day is food, you've got a problem. This resonated because I've historically been the person who spent a lot of time looking forward to the next meal or next outing. I've been working on this a lot over the past 3 years, ever since I did a Whole30. But it still feels like such an obstacle, and I really want to make more headway with this. My reasons for doing carnivore are so compelling. No way of eating has eliminated basically all of my health issues, like acid reflux, inflammation, and gut problems. I try to refer to these benefits often, but dang, every couple of weeks, I still find myself succumbing to the foods that give me that temporary excitement. You would think that the bodily pains from when I fall off the wagon would be compelling enough, but they're not. The emotional component is so strong. It's always so interesting to go back and read this because there was so much I didn't know at that time. Like knowing that a food is bad for you, assuming it's a hyperpalatable, addictive type of food, that's not enough to stop you from eating it. I go over this in my webinar for my course. Knowing sugar is unhealthy is motivation to do the work to change, but it's not the actual work. But I shared this with you because all of this points back to those definitions of addiction that I read before. I basically say, I want to stop eating these things, but I feel like I have no control over riding these cravings because the food is so addictive. Food is tremendously more addictive now than it used to be. And we have cues everywhere we go to eat. For most of people's history, we didn't have snacks everywhere. There wasn't a break room at work with a box of donuts. And now we sort of expect that we can eat everywhere and anytime, and that we should do that. Food is paired up with everything, and people will almost push it on you, particularly at social events. I can't tell you how many birthday parties I've gone to where people have asked me why I'm not eating cake. So the cues to eat are strong out in the world, but they can also be difficult at home, especially if you live with a family or someone else who isn't eating the same way as you. I found a journal entry that I wrote during my transition to carnivore. I just had an unexpected bread binge after I smelled and saw my husband's food. And I wrote, I've experienced the greatness of carnivore in improving my health. I know that the bread I want so much messes up my gut and digestion, gives me acid reflux for the rest of the night, causes weight gain, and a slew of other things. But I want it so much anyway. How can I want something that makes me feel so miserable and horrible again and again? It's an addiction. If you've ever heard that joke about the seafood diet, you see food and you eat it, if you can relate to that, I hear you. Early on in my transition to carnivore, I was really triggered by seeing foods I was trying not to eat. And in the lens of food addiction, this can feel like a really big hurdle to get over. So I think at this point, we've established enough that food addiction is a real thing. You can look more at the research and studies in the show notes if you want to explore more. But now I want to talk about what we can do about the addiction. There are a few different opinions about this. One solution that some people propose is abstinence, treating it as a true addiction that is remedied by not eating that thing ever again. And if you do end up eating it, it's treated as relapse. I think this does work for some people, but my issue with this is that you're basically saying I can never eat ice cream again. And that is really hard for me to sit with. It makes me feel extremely deprived and rebellious. There was actually a time when I set a New Year's resolution that I wasn't going to eat sugar that whole year. And what's ridiculous about this resolution is I already basically wasn't eating sugar. I would have it maybe once every couple of months, and I hadn't really been eating it very often for 3 years at that point. But about a month in, I became totally overcome by this desire for sugar, and I felt upset that I couldn't have it. And it got to the point where I started feeling really deprived and started binging on all sorts of savory things that I didn't usually eat, like croissants and cheesy bread. And guess what? I was stuffed with bread, but still wanted sugar anyway. I found out that I don't do well with this I can't have that mentality. And if you watched my episode on the Minnesota starvation experiment, how food restriction causes binging, then you know why. That is the human response to restriction. So another solution that I personally believe in more than the abstinence drug addiction model is understanding what's actually happening with addictive eating when it comes to your brain and the food environment we're in, and actively choosing whether or not you eat certain foods from a place of freedom. Kind of along the lines of my episode, Don't Blame Yourself for Struggling with Processed Foods, where I say, it's not my fault that I can't stop at just one Oreo, but it is on me if I choose to eat foods that are designed to be incredibly addictive, because I know it's going to require me to grapple for control if I consent to those kinds of foods. Our willpower has no match against these hyperpalatable foods and their stimulation of our physiology. We are going to go berserk for these foods until we see them for what they really are. When this video is over, I want you to take 5 minutes to pause in silence and reflect on your personal experience with addictive foods and addictive eating behaviors over your life. How do you view these foods that you have a hard time controlling? Do you love them and have a fondness for dunking Oreos in milk or whatever it is? Question that and think about what the entire package deal is when you eat these kinds of foods. What burden do these foods carry that you're not thinking about? If you want more videos that support the carnivore diet and help you overcome the temptation of modern foods, make sure to subscribe to the channel and also sign up for my email newsletter and receive my free guide, Joanne's Party Survival Guide for not falling off the rails and eating all the things. You can click the link below or go to www.theroadtocarnivore.com/guide.